heading to a taxidermist. The remains of their bodies were found on the blade of a saw. The man they were supposed to meet was Robert Elmer Kleasen, a man who claimed to be a spy and a war hero, a man who traveled under several aliases, and a man sentenced to death on the grounds of strong circumstantial evidence for murder.
I'm not the monster that I was portrayed, and if they dig a little deeper, well, they'll find out that I'm just an average sort of guy.
He's different. He's got a certain glow about him that's not your typical everyday person.
Maybe the most dangerous man I ever met.
Robert Kleasen's connection to these murders is only the beginning of his story. 3 years ago, Kleasen was found living in a house full of weapons, with access to another motorized saw. But this time he wasn't in Texas. He was in the heart of a terrified British community.
He is deranged, he must be. He's frightening.
He was potentially, you know, a madman. He really was.
For almost 10 years, the northern market town of Barton-on-Humber was home to a mysterious American, a man who was suspected of being a murderer, but whose skill for fantasy stories and multiple lives left an elusive air. Quite why Robert Elmer Kleasen was allowed into Britain is as yet unexplained, as is how he managed to keep his time on death row secret even from his British wife. But Robert Kleasen is a man who shows a talent for grand deception, and the residents of Barton are only the latest in a long line to fall for lies that date back to Texas more than 30 years ago. In 1974, in Austin, Texas, Robert Kleasen's unlikely rise to notoriety began from a caravan parked behind a taxidermist.
He was a customer of ours, and so we became acquainted with him that way. And the guy was in need, so he helped him out. And that's what got us involved.
And he would hang around the taxidermy shop during the day and kind of follow him around and learn how to operate the machinery and how to, cut up, animals basically.
Kleasen's appearance in Austin coincided with the end of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. It was during these unsettled times in the Texas heartland that America's most graphic horror film was released, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. 3 months later, Robert Kleasen arrived in the same city, telling his own wild stories. The local community were impressed by the newcomer, who seemed to be a genuine all-American hero.
When I met him, he claimed to have been a Korean War veteran, fighter pilot, who shot down a number of aircraft in Korea.
He always claimed to have been a CIA operative. He was also in the French Foreign Legion.
In addition to claiming he had 2 or 3 PhDs, he spoke a half a dozen languages fluently.
He claimed to be part of the operation in the Bay of Pigs.
He claimed to have been responsible for the assassination of Che Guevara.
He also claimed to have gotten court-martialed for flying under bridges.
He was very good at convincing people about anything. And he would tell stories where you really, couldn't follow up or track it, or you really didn't even feel like you needed to.
Kleasen fitted into the Texan community. He was an avid hunter, and he joined local church groups, becoming a baptized Mormon. But it wasn't long before cracks began to appear in the new arrival's story. In December 1973, Kleasen was arrested for buffalo rustling and jailed. But undeterred, the Mormon community rallied round.
Our philosophy, our beliefs in our church is, when someone is baptized into the church, then they're all our responsibility. So, Robert showed up, he needed help, and we gave it to him.
But Kleasen himself didn't show appreciation for the help. He felt his new brothers weren't doing enough.
When he got in trouble, he felt that other people had an obligation to basically bail him out. The church would not provide him with a lawyer for that he somehow thought they had an obligation to do. And he had just caused a lot of arguments in the congregation.
His general complaint was that the Mormon church had let him down while he'd been in jail. They hadn't come to visit him. They hadn't fellowshipped with him. They hadn't brought him food and clothing and toothpaste and supported him the way he thought he was entitled to be supported.
After 5 months in jail, Kleasen was released, and despite a growing unease about their newest member, a number of Mormon missionaries continued to visit him. Among them were 20-year-old Gary Darley and 19-year-old Mark Fisher, who dined with him every Monday night.
One of the missionaries in particular had kept some diaries, and in his diaries he'd indicated a sort of a growing unease about Kleasen.
We'd gone out there trying to home teach Robert Kleasen, and he just went into an absolute rage. So I witnessed how he would go from quiet to just leaping up, and with his fist clenched and just screaming and hollering and cursing.
The Mormons were becoming suspicious of a man who claimed to be a spy and secret agent, but few could have guessed the real truth. Far from being a war hero, Robert Kleasen was actually a former mental patient on the run from the police. A compulsive hoarder of firearms, he'd been sectioned for shooting up a hospital and jumped bail in Buffalo, New York, after shooting a man in the foot.
His conflict resolution method is to be violent or to threaten violence. He's in love with guns. He is just infatuated with guns.
The gun became an extension of himself and gave him power. And guns have an effect on certain psyches like that. It's a part of their body because it gives them lethal force. And they don't have to take no crap off of nobody.
Unbeknownst to the Mormon community, Kleasen's past was littered with firearms offenses and odd behavior. 3 wives had left him, the last when she found him taking a bath with a disemboweled deer.
Dear Brother Blair, sick of not doing much. I will not mess about any longer. I am going for the kill.
Now Kleasen's anger seemed focused on the Mormon church as he began to write a series of threatening letters to the local bishop.
There was a lot of things in the letters about being CIA, Big Brother was watching you.
I gave up everything I owned and was chased, hounded, tracked down, jailed, starved, and insulted, not only by my enemies, but by the church itself.
When I got through reading those letters, I knew we had a problem when I got it.
I do not want a pat on the head or a paw shake. I want blood. I want to go after my false accusers now and bring them to dishonor.
Aware that Kleasen now had a grudge against the church, Bishop McCullough put word out that the missionary visits to Kleasen's remote trailer should be stopped. For reasons of their own, Mark Fisher and Gary Darley decided to keep their regular Monday night dinner date with Kleasen.
They were committed to telling people about Jesus Christ. They cared about this lost soul, and they wanted to help him.
When I got the story back that they were still going out there, that's when I made a direct call. And I told him, Elder Darley, I really strongly advise you not to make any more visits out there. There's something wrong, and I just don't think it's a good environment for you to be. And he said, okay, Bishop, we'll make this the last trip.
They had no way of reaching him. He did not have a telephone. And this is what gentle young men they were, and kind. They wanted to go there one last time and let him know that they would not be able to return.
They had told a number of friends through the day that that is where they were going, and they were last seen, an hour or so before they were supposed to arrive at Kleasen's.
No one has ever seen Gary Darley or Mark Fisher since that night in 1974. But soon clues would emerge that would shed light on the disappearance and the bizarre world of Robert Elmer Kleasen. In In 1974, Texas police arrested a man they suspected of committing what seemed to be one of the world's most horrific murders. 2 Mormon missionaries were missing, but no bodies had been found. The police were baffled by their suspect, Robert Elmer Kleasen, a man who had a host of aliases and more than one personality.
By the time he was arrested, law enforcement was aware of the fact that he'd used a number of aliases, and one of the names he used was Richard Ratt, R-A-A-D-T.
As it turns out, Richard Ratt was a personality that he had who was supposed to be an ex-CIA agent who had been discredited during the Nixon era, and the CIA had tried to kill him. But Robert Kleasen is who Richard Ratt was.
He apparently was acting pretty strangely enough that the officers started to wonder just what they were dealing with, that there may be a mental health question here.
And right before our eyes, you could see this guy change. I mean, you know, I'd heard about personalities and stuff. I'm 24 years old, and I'm going, oh, no. And, I mean, he got to where he was really a mean-looking guy. I mean, the facial expressions, he was a badass. He scared the crap out of me.
Kleasen denied any role in the apparent murders, claiming at different times that either the Mormons never arrived at his trailer, the case was a Mormon conspiracy against him, and that the judge was a war criminal who Kleasen had information on and therefore had to be silenced.
He was, to my mind, obviously guilty from the first moment I became acquainted with the case. Right from the get-go, the evidence was that he was the last person to see him, and that he was unhappy with the Mormons, and that everybody was afraid of him. And but there was no bodies.
Despite there being no bodies, a mass of circumstantial evidence linked Kleasen to the Mormons' murder. By his trailer, the police found an ID badge with a bullet hole through it. Inside the trailer, they found the Mormons' blood-stained watches and apartment keys. Using these clues, the investigators began to piece together exactly what they thought had happened on the night that the boys disappeared.
Kleasen was apparently a very good marksman, and he had set up kind of a personal shooting gallery behind his trailer. And he would frequently shoot the target and then send his guests down to fetch the target and return for them to examine it and see how many bullseyes he had. And several of those people related to me that they would turn around and come back with a target to find Kleasen sighting down on them with the rifle, which he obviously thought was very entertaining. That may have been what happened to these young men. They may have been sent down to retrieve a target and were shot.
The prosecutor's answer to what then happened to the bodies also lay in Kleasen's trailer. They seized a seemingly innocuous manuscript written by a John T. Williamson. Williamson was another alias of Kleasen, and in it he described in detail his habits of killing, dissecting, and disposing of animal carcasses.
The whole deer can really be cut up to fit a very small space.
He went into great detail in there, not only about how many deer he would kill, but also how to get rid of carcasses. And of course, he didn't put it in human terms, but it's easy enough to translate that into human terms.
You certainly never set out any of the deer parts in your garbage. Leave no evidence such as guts behind.
The district attorney held up that notebook and read from it to the jury and, you know, said, this is what happened to those bodies.
The final pieces of the jigsaw were falling into place for the prosecution. Forensic scientists examined the taxidermy studio next to Kleasen's trailer. In it was a bandsaw used for cutting up slaughtered animals. On the blade of the saw, they found hair that matched that of Gary Darley and Mark Fisher.
It appears that he dissected them, cut them up. He actually threw the body parts in what's called a tankerage pile behind the taxidermy shop with other carcasses and stuff, and it was hauled off to be made out of fertilizer. But because you had human head, somebody would see that. It looks like he actually took the bandsaw and cut the heads, sliced the heads apart.
These were two people known to Kleasen, people who were trying to help him out. Young men who were being nice guys. To take the head of somebody and cut it up, basically in the blade of a bandsaw. I couldn't do that. I don't think a normal human being can do that. The sort of gag reflex would prevent you from doing it.
The prosecution theory was enough to convince the Texan jury, and Kleasen was found guilty of murder. But his time in court wasn't over. The same jury had to decide whether to sentence him to life imprisonment or death. Against the wishes of his defense team, Kleasen now took matters into his own hands. He took the witness stand and allowed the prosecution to read the threatening letters he'd sent to a number of Mormons.
I am drawing my guns. I'm going into action. Nothing new to me.
I'm going for blood, and I'm coming in for the kill.
I want their heads, and if they want to fight, I mean, they were very violent, bombastic sort of letters.
We didn't really think the jury was going to like hearing that, and apparently they didn't.
My eternal life is on the line this fight, and I do not intend to lose this fight.
Kleasen's demeanor, the content of those letters, and some of the other stuff that he left seems to have removed any doubt with the jury about what they should do with him, and they returned a death sentence very quickly.
For the next 3 years, Robert Kleasen was held on death row. He was about to go down in history as the real Texas Chainsaw Killer, and as his death sentence approached, the media swarmed round him.
No, I'm not a killer. I'm not a killer, so...
Yeah, are you optimistic about it? How do you feel now?
Yes, very much so.
So, do you believe that you will not ever die in the electric chair?
I don't believe I will, no.
Kleasen still denied the murders, but strong circumstantial evidence had convicted him. His chances of escaping the death penalty were tiny. But with time running out, a legal technicality emerged that was about to provide Kleasen with an escape route.
There had been a search warrant issued to search his trailer. Some of the evidence used against him in the trial was as the result of that search warrant, like the manuscript. And the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals decided that there was a defect in the search warrant, and that therefore the search warrant was invalid, and that anything that was the result of that search couldn't be used in a retrial. They didn't say he was innocent. They didn't say he couldn't be retried. They said you just have to have a trial that is fair and conforms with the rules of law. So they reversed it based on that.
Kleasen would have to be retried without the blood-stained watches, the poacher's notebook, or any of the items found in his trailer. Without that evidence, a second jury might decide Kleasen was innocent and free him. For the prosecutors, it was too big a risk to retry him for murder. Instead, they refiled other outstanding charges to keep him behind bars. He was convicted of shooting a man in the foot in New York, and together with other gun charges, they ensured Kleasen would be in prison for at least 9 years. But Robert Kleasen had beaten the death sentence and was already planning for the future.
He pen-palled with a lot of women. He joined these pen-pal clubs. They'd give him a list of people who wanted to pen-pal, and he'd write his CIA stories and war hero stories, and gee, I got all these degrees.
In the northeast of England, a policeman's widow was beginning a correspondence she would come to regret.
Marie had been married before and her husband had died, and she joined something called the International Pen Friends Club in Dublin, and they sent her a long list of people, and she simply wrote to a few at a time as she felt that she wanted to. And one of these names was Robert Elmer Kleasen.
He wrote saying that he was not an inmate. He was, in fact, a college professor come to bring wisdom and enlightenment to these prison inmates by teaching classes and teaching them languages and so on.
He would somehow acquire black and white photographs or photographs from the other inmates, then send them to Marie and say, this is where I went this weekend. These are the things I saw, but I'm sorry I'm not in the photograph, because of course I was taking it and I'm a keen photographer. But what he did was he got her to disclose more and more of her personal circumstances, so that he eventually discovered, for instance, that she had very modest financial reserves, but she did have some.
Over a period of years, Kleasen wrote with increasing regularity until his release date finally arrived in 1988 in Buffalo, New York. But while he had managed to keep his true identity secret from his pen pal, in his home city, the man thought responsible for the real Texas Chainsaw Massacre was about to become the center of attention.
Topping tonight's Eyewitness News, the question, what are they going to do with Robert Elmer Kleasen?
At this hour, a frenzy of movement on the legal and social front as former death row inmate Robert Kleasen became a free man in Buffalo.
And I'm watching TV, and the name Robert E. Gleason released a murderer. He's in town. We don't want him here. I said, Jesus, I said, that's that Bob that I used to hang around with.
Kleasen isn't wanted in this neighborhood or any other, and he knows that.
He's a walking time bomb. I certainly wouldn't want him living next door to me, and I wouldn't wish him to live next door to anybody else.
Kleasen had the misfortune, apparently, of having this news story break during what we call sweeps weeks in the United States, when the television stations in particular are sort of trying to raise their ratings. And suddenly he is just like a banner headline feature on the evening news.
By midday, Kleasen was handcuffed and escorted to the Erie County Medical Center.
Robert Kleasen is here at the Buffalo Psychiatric Center.
It's on Channel 7, and it was on Channel 4. Robert E. Gleason's at the city mission. We don't want him there. He's liable to kill people in the city mission.
Dan, Robert Kleasen will spend another night here at the city mission.
Undercover officers are shadowing Kleasen's movement.
Gentlemen, I can just about see with that those lights in my face. I'm not the monster that I was portrayed. And if they dig a little deeper, well, they'll find out that I'm just an average sort of guy.
While Kleasen's notoriety spread in Buffalo, he was busy making plans to leave the country as soon as his parole was complete. Robert Elmer Kleasen was on his way to England.
Watch posted on Mr. Kleasen in the community.
We don't want Mr. Kleasen in this community. Obviously, he's a danger to the people in any community that he resides.
In the United States, Robert Elmer Kleasen was the man thought responsible for the real Texas Chainsaw Massacre. A man constantly tracked by news crews and feared by local residents. In Barton-on-Humber, a picturesque market town in the northeast of England, they were expecting a visit from a Robert Elmer Kleasen, who described himself as a prison teacher, a gentleman, and a prospective husband.
If some character like this, who is a United States citizen, decides that they are going to leave the United States and go to another country, apparently we don't necessarily have an obligation to advise other people of that. And if you get your passport back, you can go anywhere where the people will let you in.
Simple checks should have uncovered things. There's a thing called Interpol, isn't there?
Kleasen had concealed his past convictions and time on death row from immigration and had built up a pen-pal relationship with Marie Longley, a policeman's widow in Barton-on-Humber. Now he was arriving for what Marie Longley thought was a short holiday.
She was a great letter writer, you see, and I think she'd been writing, obviously, for some long time.
Yes.
And probably enjoyed the correspondence. And when he obviously offered to, said we would like to come over for a holiday, she just welcomed him.
And suddenly there are boxes arriving. And I don't just mean the odd one, I mean dozens of them, full of the most incredible rubbish, up to and including, I seem to remember, tins of macaroni. And she didn't know what to think of this, and this old world, charming, pleasant man arrived. Very helpful, very respectful, was absolutely as nice as he possibly could be to her.
4 months after his arrival, Marie Longley was married to a man she thought was a former CIA agent and war hero. On his wedding day, Kleasen wore a Congressional Medal of Honor, the highest American military award. It was the first in a new set of fantasies that would take in not just Marie, but the whole community.
It wasn't long before he was showing us his Congressional Medal Award, presented to him by President Eisenhower.
He said he'd got Purple Heart.
I won that, he said, by doing sorties over 3 or 4 days in Korea, dropping napalm on in John Pass or something like that.
I forget how many MiGs he thought he'd shot down, but it grows with every time he tells it.
We'd shot down 31 MiGs, I think it was.
He'd shot 34 MiGs down.
He'd worked for the CIA.
He was an assassin.
He was a U-2 pilot.
I had no reason to doubt him because he was a lot older than me.
I think I give him the benefit of the doubt, just like everybody else.
I was impressed with his stories because it was just, you could make a film of it and put it on the telly and you could have a serial.
There we are. Van Kleasen. Mr. Kleasen. Bob, throw one up. Throw one in the air.
While Kleasen seemed little more than eccentric to most, he was already moving himself closer to the kind of hunting and gun community he had lived within in Texas. It wasn't quite big game, but the local duck and wildfowlers eventually allowed him to join. Then the former mental patient and death row inmate applied for a British gun license.
You have to have a very good reason for either refusing or revoking someone's certificate, and essentially have to show that a person is a danger to public safety or to the peace. At that particular time, for foreign nationals, it was not usual, unless there was a very good reason, to go checking back in the country where they were born, where they'd lived.
If any of the police officers dealing with it had have rung Travis County, even the girl in the office would have told them who Gleason was.
There we are, Mr. Gleason there.
Is that a coot out there?
Kleasen indicated to the immigration authorities when he first arrived in this country that he had no previous convictions, and of course when he put his applications in for the certificates, he indicated likewise.
He manages to get a permit not only to possess firearms, which is much more difficult obviously in England than in the United States, but a permit to deal in them. And he starts stockpiling guns again. You know, your worst nightmare, a paranoid schizophrenic with a gun fetish and an anger problem.
Kleasen receiving a gun license marked a change in his behavior. Marie Longley's listed cottage was overrun as his gun obsession took over.
I'm sure she had absolutely no say in the matter because he would have hit her if she'd said anything. But he tore a wall out and he put a stairway up to the false roof. He had his bedroom taken over by loading machines for ammunition and stacks of ammunition.
Patterns of behavior from Texas were repeated as he began to intimidate his wife with his weapons.
As he cleaned his guns, as the princess, as he got hold of them, he would always sight them up at her head. It meant that if she didn't do as she was told, he would shoot her. And eventually she realised that he was actually a very disturbed man that she lumbered herself with. And Marie's rather old-fashioned. She believes that if you make a mistake, you have to live with the consequences. And that's what she did.
The man thought responsible for the real Texas Chainsaw Massacre had rearmed. Concealing his past, he was now a local gun expert, swapping Christmas cards with the police and advising them on ammunition. But according to her friends, Marie Longley's life was about to reach a new low ebb.
He beat her so badly that she was unable to leave the house for a fortnight. And he made her ring up people and make excuses so that they wouldn't come to the house, she didn't go out, and they wouldn't see her face. And he wouldn't take her to the hospital. He wouldn't let her see a doctor. But it was very, very brutal indeed. After he beat her up, which was quite early in the marriage, Marie got her stuff, moved it into this back room, and she would hide in there mostly from when he got up about midday, only coming down to do necessary things. She really had something like 5 years living in that little room.
We were really unaware of it. Most of that kind of thing goes on behind closed doors. You don't know. All I knew, he was a pal that I was shooting with.
People usually liked him to start off with. On the first few stories that they heard, it was a case of an interesting bloke. But then the more and more stories, it's sort of like, well, is this interesting or is it just bullshit?
Kleasen had joined a number of gun clubs in the Northeast, but fellow members soon became suspicious of his eccentricities.
When he's friendly with you, he's nice. It's only when you cross him, like you sell him a gun and he doesn't pay you and you want your money, then he'll rear up. He's quite horrible then.
He had a temper. He flared up so quickly. You'd see a change in his features and his eyes, and all of a sudden he could be like a wild man. His face, the way it distorted, and then he would approach you into your domain and push his...
Kleasen had been nicknamed Odd Bob or Mad Yank by some fellow shooters. But in late 1993, an incident occurred that stopped many people giving him any time at all.
One night he was out and Bob parked his car where it should have been parked. And as they come off the pond during the hours of darkness, another ex-member of the Wildfowlers said, "Is this your so-and-so car?"
It was basically a parking offence, what we're talking about, nothing major. It was no big argument or anything like that.
Bob sat in his car for a short period of time, probably thought to himself, "I'm not going to be spoke to like that." Took his gun out of his gun case, loaded it up.
And then out of the dark came Robert Kleasen and pointed the double-barrel shotgun underneath John's face.
And said, "If you was in Texas, I'd blow your so-and-so brains out."
Then I taught Mad Yank to give me his gun. I took the gun off him, unloaded the gun myself. So I can definitely say it was loaded, and it was used in a very, very threatening manner. Mad Yank did say that the reason why he behaved in such a manner was he was CIA trained. That was how he was taught to react in a situation. He had left me in the company of an armed man. He was my saviour, in effect.
The incident was taken to court. Kleasen claimed that he himself had had a gun pointed at him, and both men involved were fined. But no one in the police checked with the American authorities to see exactly who the elusive American in their midst was. Kleasen was allowed to keep his license to possess and deal in guns.
He went to court and he was bound over to keep the peace. But I think at that point, A, we should have perhaps done some more checks. And secondly, I think we should have considered more carefully whether or not we should have returned his shotguns and his license to him.
While the police didn't act after the incident, the gun clubs themselves were now looking for any reason they could to expel the Mad Yank. Gun shop owner Tony Fox had always been suspicious about the Medal of Honor Kleasen wore on his wedding day. In early 1999, he faxed a letter to the Medal of Honor Society in America.
"Dear sir, I'm writing to your good selves in the hope that you can assist with a problem that we have. Last year, a new member joined us. His name was Dr. Robert Elmer Kleasen. He claims to be a veteran of the Korean War who was decorated by your President Eisenhower with the Congressional Medal of Honor. He claims that he was given this for shooting down some 34 MiG fighters."
The reply to his letter would mark the beginning of the end of Robert Kleasen's bizarre life in Britain.
They said, in effect, that he was a fraud and that he wasn't a recipient of a medal.
You've dreamt about this day since you were a little girl.
Hanging.
And received a death threat in return.
He left me absolutely no doubt he was going to whack me if it got out. He said, "You know what I'm capable of," and that was always going to tell the matter. And I assured him that it was between me and him if he resigned, and he did. And I deceived him, actually, because I'd already faxed it through to the police.
Finally, with this information provided by an amateur sleuth, the police began doing their own investigation into who Robert Kleasen really was.
I then went to see my superintendent and said, "Look, I think we ought to do some real digging around with this guy, because I'm not too sure who he is." And as a result of that, he said, "Well, I think we must do an Interpol inquiry." After a while, the inquiry came back, and I have to say I was quite shocked when I saw these convictions of a man called Kleasen.
The police now knew Kleasen had shot a man and had a history of firearms offences. But crucially, no one knew anything about his connection with the disappearance of the Mormon missionaries in Texas. The police moved in, raiding the cottage and confiscating the things Kleasen loved the most, his guns.
He was just a blubbering wreck, a totally blubbering wreck. He sat down in the chair and he cried, I would say, for about 5 hours non-stop whilst we were there, logging everything.
The police confiscated 42 guns, including a Thompson submachine gun, from a distraught Kleasen.
He howled and howled for weeks and weeks. I mean, we would talk about it, and she said he's still crying. And he would say, well, they've taken my children away, they've taken my children away. And they were his children to him. That was the sort of depth of his mental confusion, I suppose.
Kleasen was now a man on the edge. His guns had been taken, but his wife remained. As in Texas in 1974, everyone around him felt threatened by his presence.
He'd have a coffee table, and to the leg next to him was a knife strapped to it.
There was a beam in the old cottage above his head, and on the side that he could see but a visitor couldn't was another knife ready to get hold of.
He had a hit list. He had a list of people's names who was on that list that he was going to do things to them.
I thought the only way he would whack me is if he did it sneaky. It would hardly come into the front of the shop and do it, because he knew there was a good chance that I could defend myself. But I felt that he might well do it to his wife.
At one time he threatened Mary that if ever she left him, he would set fire to the house. And we were bothered, weren't we? Do you remember?
Of course we were, because we were attached to it.
The police still hadn't found out about Kleasen's murder conviction in Texas, but Liz Butterfield was unnerved to find that Kleasen had moved a bandsaw into the cottage that he claimed he used to cut up logs. Keen to fill in the missing gaps in Kleasen's past, she asked her computer-literate son to help out.
Mum had explained to me, from information Marie had found out, that he'd been in New York jail system. So I went to the New York Department of Corrections website, and I couldn't believe it. They actually put prisoners' records up there. I was able to type in Kleasen, Robert Elmer, and up come this assault charge.
That was a shock in itself. And the link from there led us to the Texas state records, which were the awful moment.
You sat there, you just don't want to move. You're looking at the computer screen, you don't want to take it in. It's this denial factor again. You think, no, it can't be right.
Chris just rang up and said, you just don't want to know this. He's been on death row for murder.
Liz now believed her best friend was married to a murderer and headed for Barton to confront Marie.
How do you tell somebody that they're married to a murderer? And I think by then she'd got this awful feeling that this was something terrible. And I sat her down with a cup of tea and said, I need you to look at this, and it's just not going to be good. And she just shook. I have never in all my life seen anybody turn grey. Absolutely grey, putty-coloured. And she just shook, and she shook and shook for about half an hour. And I thought I'd killed her. It was really one of the worst things I've ever had to do.
For most of the afternoon, Liz Butterfield tried to persuade her friend to leave the house immediately, but Marie refused.
So I said, OK, I accept what you're saying. You're not going to leave. You can't do it. But please, at least you owe me an answer. Why can't you do it? And this tiny little voice came out and said, because he says if I leave him, he's going to kill me. He's going to shoot me. And he is. And if I leave him and I go to your place, he's going to hunt me down, shoot me, and he's going to kill you too, and I can't have that happen.
Later that afternoon, Marie Longley returned home to the cottage she shared with Robert Kleasen. 3 days later, she disappeared.
Mr. Kleasen.
In 1999, the residents of a small northern town exposed Robert Elmer Kleasen as a liar and suspected murderer. His wife had also found out about his connection with the disappearance in 1974 of 2 Mormon missionaries. But now a police search had begun because she had gone missing.
They'd sort of been to see about this missing person report from this man they'd now discovered was dangerous, was, dear God, there's a bandsaw in the kitchen. And their first thought was that she was in the Humber in pieces.
We thought something had happened to her. Because we knew of his background, then with his wife going missing, we thought that was rather strange. I was very, very concerned that some harm had come to her.
Marie Longley had told friends she was living in fear of her life. Now there was no sign of her at her cottage. But it would shortly emerge that her disappearance had not been engineered by Kleasen, but by her best friend.
Nobody else knew about it except she and Liz, because she just dare not tell anybody.
It was absolute secrecy. She even assumed another name.
We didn't think anybody would believe us. She didn't expect any support from the police because they came to the house and consulted him over guns, sent him Christmas cards. So we had to do it ourselves.
Days before her disappearance, Liz Butterfield had begun an elaborate escape plan. Documents were posted to a safe house and a fake jumble sale was arranged to allay the fears of the increasingly paranoid Kleasen.
Now, Marie does a lot of charitable work, and especially for animals, she always has done. And the Cats Protection League is one of her favourites. So she simply said to Bob that she was putting out some bags for the Cats Protection League.
On the morning of the escape, arthritic Liz Butterfield and pensioner Marie woke at dawn to avoid Kleasen.
So I drove up to be there for 8 o'clock. I got the dog in the car, that was first priority. 4 bags of what appeared to be jumble in these 4 plastic bags.
They were terrified for their lives, and a friend especially. She was very concerned that he was capable of killing Air.
Fearful of waking Kleasen, the women crept around the house gathering bags before making their way to a waiting car.
Just in case he woke up and tried to follow us, we came all the back roads, and I know Lincolnshire like the back of my hand, and we came routes he couldn't possibly know.
Marie Longley ended the day in a safe house 50 miles from Barton. The police eventually found her there 5 days later. Again, they raided the cottage and found 2 more illegally held pistols. One, an assassin's pistol, complete with silencer.
Here we've got one of the 2 pistols which were recovered when we searched his premises. This is what he claimed in interview had been his own personal issue weapon when he'd worked for the CIA. And the reason why he'd kept it was for sentimental reasons.
Kleasen was a very accurate shooter, and he would be able to kill someone with 100 yards without any problem whatsoever. I can't think of a reason why he would have that.
Other than it was part of his fantasy. If he genuinely believed that was his weapon in the CIA, and that he used it to assassinate people.
Hello and welcome to Look North.
On tonight's programme,
Robert Kleasen, the American who survived death row and then built an arsenal of weapons in his Lincolnshire home.
Tonight's top story, the American gunman who spent time on death row.
Mr. Kleasen, is there anything you want to say at this stage, given the court case? No comment.
10 years after leaving Buffalo, Robert Kleasen's cover was finally blown as he once again became the centre of media attention.
In America, he was described as an extremely dangerous man who would constitute a threat to society if ever released.
But a fascination with violent weapons proved his downfall again.
In March 2000, Kleasen was charged with illegally possessing guns. Marie was granted a divorce from him, and this should have been the last chapter in his bizarre life in Britain. But remarkably, Robert Kleasen was released pending sentencing and allowed to return to Barton.
He'd been let out on bail. He threatened to kill me and his wife. I was concerned, quite annoyed at the judiciary that let out a psychotic on bail, frankly.
The magistrates paroled him out back home, but it wasn't his home.
He had to report to the police station every day.
It was the house that Mary had run away from, and it was hers. And she daren't go back.
As soon as he was released, the ever-resourceful Kleasen was writing to pen pals again, this time in Germany. Locals believed Kleasen had no intention of returning to court and was planning to relocate to the continent.
It was so predictable. It was like the sun coming up tomorrow. You knew he was going to do it, because he always did this. He always ran away at that particular point.
One late afternoon in spring 2000, Kleasen made his way to Hull docks with a German woman who would become his 5th wife and a van full of Marie Longley's furniture.
We placed him under surveillance because we were becoming even more concerned that he was going to skip the country. He was followed to North Sea ferries. He'd taken quite a few of his possessions down to the North Sea ferries, and they were all booked on. He wasn't, but the officers at the time were that concerned that he was going to stow away that they decided to arrest him.
Kleasen was eventually sentenced to 3 years for illegally possessing guns. But despite having completed that sentence, he remained in Belmarsh prison. Proceedings had begun to extradite him back to Texas because new evidence had been found in the case of the Mormon missionary murders.
They now had kind of a jumpsuit that was found stuffed in a metal drum outside of his trailer that had smears of blood and hair on it. And they've been able to establish that that blood and hair came from both of the victims.
In downtown Austin, the prosecutors reopened the case against Kleasen and were looking forward to getting him back to Texas.
He is fighting extradition, and we're told that the process of extradition could take up to 2 years, perhaps. And we want to get him back. We've got a score to settle with Kleasen.
But Kleasen ensured he would evade the prosecutors once and for all. After suffering suspected heart failure, 70-year-old Robert Kleasen died. Few people are mourning Kleasen's passing in Barton. Marie Longley has moved back into her cottage, but is still feeling the effects of living a decade with a suspected murderer.
Imagine you've gone from being a quite vivacious and lively lady in your late 50s to living 10 years of hell with a man like Kleasen. She's ill, she's not well, she's in a lot of pain with arthritis. And she just wants to be left alone, which is why she's not appearing in this programme.
He was certainly not of stable mind. Not only was an embellisher of facts, he was potentially, you know, a madman. He really was.
Very crafty man, very crafty.
Very evilly crafty.
Evilly crafty.
Oh, and frightening. Oh.